Appreciate the opportunity to present to a talented group of individuals. As someone who observes Rand and appreciates Rand's work from the outside, it's actually kind of cool for me to be presenting to you today. Sunday hinted at this. You're probably wondering how I got here. My job as a fractional CFO allows me to serve several companies, but it also allows me time to dive into some ideas and my own ventures. It allows me some time to work on that. One of my clients actually serves on a board with Susan Marquise, and he introduced me to her because he thought that this idea was something that she would kind of gravitate towards too. And she ended up introducing me to Todd and Ashande. So here I am, and grateful to be here. The impetus of this idea came from a pointed question to me from a journalist. I was attempting to right a wrong in the community, and a local paper suggested I run against an unopposed candidate. They asked me a question, what my platform would be, and after some considerable thought, my answer was I wouldn't have one. I envisioned being a representative that used technology to be informed by their constituents on a regular basis, checking an application before voting to check in on how my constituents felt about the legislation I was to vote on that day. The app would also enable the community to engage on ideas for future legislation. Slide. I guess why is this, why now for this? This was an idea that I've developed over the last, 5 to 8 years. And I guess kind of how it fits into it now is it feels like there's an opportunity for some disruption in the political arena, considering everything that is going on. And the advancements of social media have gotten to the point where, we are liking and voting every day. So why not apply that to our legislative process? What this is not a direct democracy. It's more a participatory democracy, and allowing us to engage our legislators on a more regular basis. Our communication, I believe, is currently one way. We get to hear about current legislation that's being proposed. If it's very important, then people write in, fax, things, email their representatives, call them. It's very one way and directional. And you never really hear, other than what the actual vote is, I don't think it's ever really followed up on. So what we're trying to do is create some engagement and also accountability. Let's skip this. I did spend a little bit of time. This is not scientific in any way, but I did do a quick survey on SurveyMonkey across 126 individuals, ages 18 to 34. I was targeting a very specific set because I think this ultimately has a very specific function in engaging millennials and the next generation, and hopefully then being in the future, more widely used as those individuals age into the political arena. Some highlights: 71% of respondents expressed an interest in the app to participate in the legislative process, and only 10% feel that they're represented by their official. Go to the next slide. So how this works. Pretty simple process. The app users receive notification that a bill has been posted, and they get a brief summary of what this legislation is and what it does. They then vote yes or no. That information is accumulated and sent to the representative who's part of the platform or chooses not to be, up to them. The legislator votes, and that vote is then communicated back to the user in a summarized form, either weekly or monthly. It says, here's how you voted, here's how your rep voted on these legislative bills. Closing the feedback loop. Also, users can submit ideas that they feel should warrant legislation. It creates an opportunity for a people's think tank. Ideally, the long-term goal would be to build a people's think tank where the community-driven ideas within the app are researched by a panel and suggested legislation drafted, presented to the members of Congress. When I first presented this to Todd and Sonde, there were some unanswered questions that we came up with, and I hope we come up with more. But one of them was, how do we craft nonpartisan summaries of legislation? I ended up reaching out to Ellen Shearer of Northwestern. Obviously, Northwestern has a reputation for being one of the top schools for journalism. And our conversation was pretty good on Tuesday, in that she gave me some ideas on how this could be done. First of all, she pointed me to the fact that every legislative bill has a committee summary that comes out with the legislative bill to summarize for all parties involved. I asked her if it's generally nonpartisan. She said maybe 50-50. She couldn't say either way, but there's ways to make sure that it ends up not being partisan. She suggested that we concentrate on the what, not the why, and avoid intent in the drafting of the summaries. She warned against AstroTurf, which I didn't know what this meant, and I kind of gave her a funny look. And so I had to look it up after she explained it a little bit. But AstroTurf is what's happening these days is lobbyists and the parties that be are gaining gaining popularity for an idea or legislative bill through the general public. So they're creating the buzz around something through other channels. And it almost looks like the people actually want it. So she warned against that. And then Todd and Sunday, they were talking about how do you summarize large legislative bills? And what I came up with is legislative bites. So breaking down the legislation into smaller pieces that create the vote as a whole would be a possible idea to overcome that. And then short form, in the long term, it would be ideal to do short form legislation, which would be 1 to 5 pages of legislation per bill, in order for it to be easily disseminated. So that's Yay Nay app in a nutshell. Pretty simple, but I would love to hear some questions or considerations from everybody here.
So I'll just start off with a dumb question. Are effective legislations necessarily simple? Is it possible that there are some aspects of legislation that have to be complex and might not fit within our legislative bite?
That is certainly possible. But again, I think the idea is to give enough information to make an informed decision, if that answers your question.
So I have a concern. Oh, sorry. Are we wrapped up with that one?
Go for it, Tim.
Okay. So I have a concern with this approach that, let's see. So it seems to me direct democracy. I mean, if you were to make this just straight direct democracy, right? Do away with the legislators entirely, just let people vote. It would be like doing everything by ballot initiative in California. And direct democracy has real problems in that you get people, all people read is the summary, and they give it, 30 seconds of thought and say yay or nay. And I think that leads to some really pretty ill-considered decisions. Right. And I'm afraid that this would put a lot of pressure on legislators to vote the way that people on 30 seconds of consideration of one paragraph wanted them to vote. And so one way I could see to mitigate that would be to not just show, here's the bill, here's what your legislator has to say about the bill. Like, here's the nonpartisan summary. Here's your elected representative says this about it. I think this looks like a good idea because of this. I'd be interested to hear your opinions about that, blah, blah, blah. Have people yay, nay, provide feedback on that. Might get away a little bit from those just snap judgments where people are making short-sighted decisions.
I actually like that because it engages the legislator as well with their constituents. So yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Something actually related to that, I was going to ask if you have heard of this idea of liquid democracy or heard that phrase, heard that idea chapter. I'm sure it's dime a dozen different takes on the stuff, but this was one of them. But it ties into what Tim was saying a little bit, in that the idea with that is using, in that case, I think that the core of the idea was using a distributed ledger kind of system where individuals can either vote directly on any issue or delegate their vote to someone else that they trust to take the time to look at it, I think. And I'd be interested in what you think of as sort of an alternative to that, because I like the idea of engaging the legislator in the dialogue, but also maybe having some way of being able to delegate your vote to someone else you trust to dive into an issue like that.
Great suggestion. I just looked it up. I hadn't heard of that. I was going down the road of, obviously, I think this fits well in a blockchain environment, and I'm talking to some professors at Duke who are launching a new program around blockchain technology. So yeah, this was going to be a part. It was going to be a part of a blockchain play eventually, but I will do some research around this to see how that fits. It looks like it's got a pretty cool idea behind it.
I mean, I think both of these, something that strikes me is that there's sort of a way of grafting a new kind of way of participating in things onto the existing system, which I think is a really interesting trait of it, I guess.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
So is this, I think there's a whole discussion to be had about how complex and lengthy legislation documents are, and whether or not that's actually necessary.
Yeah.
And whether or not that's actually just the best way to make people think that you're actually doing something is to generate a bunch of crap. And the thicker the legislative document, the more people perceive that you've actually done something. So can this be a lever to actually try and change that? And I guess simplifying the tax code is one of the most obvious examples of this approach. But I was struck by the healthcare plan book that was trotted out as a prop. And I think that any legislation in Washington, D.C. it's become almost a bad joke. So because this would need to summarize, I mean, can we actually use this to go further and say that can't you write a 5-page legislation document, or is that just impossible now?
Yeah, I think it's a great question and possible leverage, because I guess the way as I view it now is I don't know. I don't know that all these are 1,000 pages, right? And why are they 1,000 pages? What's in them? And why does it have to be that way? And just kind of shining a light on, look, guys, break it down, like this shouldn't be that hard. What else are you jamming in there that is not necessary? And, everybody's just packing it to the brim of what they need to get done as part of the whole. And it's probably non-related items to the general purpose of the bill.
I do think, though, that legislation does get, trying to actually write down a law that covers the various corner cases and efforts to get around it and stuff can be pretty hard. I think there is a certain amount of complexity. I mean, this is always my issue with trying to vote on ballot initiatives, and why I don't usually read the description, the thing I'm supposed to vote on. If I haven't researched it before I go to the polling place, I'm not going to read the paragraph and decide whether I think that's a good idea or not, just because there's so much more to legislation than you can put in a paragraph. I want to read organizations I trust, or representatives I trust, people who have spent hours with this and talked to other people who have spent hours with it, who have really been involved with writing it. Like, okay, who's funding it? Who's funding this side? Who's funding that side? Whose interest is it in? Once I know that stuff, then I can figure out what to vote for. But often the description isn't, these things are complicated. I don't think you can make them all that short. So it seems like the real challenge here is how to provide some way for some of that nuance to come in. Like, it would be fascinating to know who's supporting it.
So
as
a
soon as I
network
know
diagram.
if this person's supporting it, yeah. As soon as I know if this PAC is supporting it, I'm against it. There are ones there. There are times when it's that clear.
Yeah. So
where it originated from.
That too. Yeah. Who wrote it?
So it does sound like with legislative bills, there are two types of information. There is information about the origination and the support for the bill, and then there's information about the bill itself. If we think about those types of information and try figure out ways to try to make it more accessible, more exposed to the citizens, I think that will satisfy your ultimate goal. On the issue of trying to make the information within the bill more understandable, I can imagine the development of NLP type tools to create shorter summaries for larger bills that can be read at different reading levels, and that easier to read summaries that help the reader sort of make more sense of what each part is trying to do. I think there are enough tools that can do stuff like that out there already, and it's just a question of applying it to bills. The information about the origination and the support for a bill, it's really a question of dashboarding or presenting information in an accessible manner. It's all out there, at least most of it is, and so yeah.
So Ashunde, do you think that NLP to do this type of summarization is easier, the same, or harder than like doing sort of generic natural language?
So yeah, you're referring to the domain-specific nature of legislative language?
Well, so I think there's two problems that I see. One is the domain knowledge, which actually usually is a benefit in NLP, because then you know that the language is going to be within a domain, so you can restrict your corpus and all of that sort of stuff. But the other piece is that my sense is that these are not written in a way that are really designed to be understood. Again, I'm putting my cynic hat back on. And so, we know NL doesn't deal well with slang. I'm curious if it's possible to train ML algorithms to be able to really parse and understand legislationese.
So it sounds to me like this is my favorite cop-out. It sounds to me like that's an empirical question to try to test. But the argument for the possibility of using NLP models to do this would be that language is intelligible to somebody out there in DC or in the state capitals. So there seems to be a core of meaning in the text that is shared among enough people. And better than that, there is enough examples of these types of legislative bills that as long as that kernel of meaning exists, that kernel of intelligibility exists, and we have enough data on that style of discourse, you can always train a custom model to try to get at that type of understanding. Now, if it is the case that all of it is just charlatanism and jargon with no meaning whatsoever, then yes, I can expect that the models would not work at all. But it makes sense to somebody.
Well, you've got tons of training data, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think I don't think that bills are written to be. I mean, occasionally there is some program that somebody's trying to hide in there. That does happen, but I don't think it's the rule. I think that's the exception. I think for the most part it is, well, like with a lot of legal language where you read it and you're just like, well, okay, so this is apparently just to make sure that no one but lawyers can ever read this stuff. But it turns out for lawyers, legal documents are written in a way that is unambiguous. It actually is pretty much machine parsable, but you have to have the right kind of machine, which most of us don't have. Law school turns you into the right kind of machine to actually interpret that stuff. But it interprets pretty unambiguously once you know how to do it. I think legislation is more like that. I think it's usually not designed just to be unreadable. I think it's just unreadable by laymen and non-specialist NLP programs. I think there's some hope there.
Isn't one of the problems though with the
did I raise my hand? Is that why you paused?
Yeah.
I just wanted to interject because I've been thinking about this issue both in the legal domain and in a sort of similar domain of analyzing like 200-page long like DoD directives, these like really long, dry technical policy documents. And in both cases, we have lots of data that we can train these models on, so we can handle the domain-specific issue. I haven't done like exhaustive investigations into this, but like my impression is that these like state-of-the-art transformer models, which do a really great job, can work well like at a paragraph or 2 or 3 paragraph level. But when you start looking at like this really complex document that refers to itself like multiple ways, with sections and subsections and subsections, I think that's when you start they start breaking down. So I think like there's nothing stopping this from working in principle, but the practicality of it might just be a little bit further away in time from where we are now. And then like, Tim, to your point, like I think an obvious idea is why don't you try to write legislation in like a certain format that is machine readable?
Exactly.
It's almost there already. Like why not just kind of make some sort of data structure that could be like appropriate for NLP understanding of these texts, and it like directly tells you what section it's pointing to and why, and what parts of other legislation it's like dependent upon. And if you kind of like build that in to begin with, this would really facilitate this issue.
It is almost there. DoD documents, I haven't spent a lot of time with them, but to the extent I have had to dive into DoD documents, I've been amazed at how systematic they are. It is, it's what the Army does. Is by the numbers, cite the thing and refer to this order and that order. And boy, they actually do work like machines. It's cool. So, and I don't know, I think legislation tries to do that, but it would be cool to have software assists where you could be sure that you really were structuring it the way you meant to structure it.
Something that I was thinking about and listening to this is that this obviously would be a step one, but so much of what's important for casting a vote on something is what's not written down, right? It's like how what are the implications for those rules? How does it interact with other legislation? What are kind of perverse incentives or possible ways that it could be exploited, and ways that are actually not written down? It's the challenge is trying to vote on something and not really being able to understand all of that by just what a thing says it's going to do or what it's intended to do.
Suspending the payroll tax seems like a great idea until you realize that is what pays for Social Security.
Right. And so having be interesting of having some ways of being able to attach and embed sort of discussion around those consequences of things, or what would it be like to have kind of a crowdsourced red teaming effort around how something could go wrong.
So in military language, that's it's looking at second and third order effects. Well, it's not military language, but that's where I first encountered it. It would be there, I think there's a whole bunch of NLP stuff that could be done on this. The other thing, getting towards some of the previous comments, if you could generate a network diagram of who's behind this, who's for it, and who's against it, I think that would be interesting visual. And then somehow being able to visualize second and third order effects would be another piece of that. And I'm curious whether or not, I mean, the holy grail would be that you could have an algorithm that would be able to do the NL analysis and auto-generate both the network diagram and the second and third order effects. My cat doesn't agree, but.
Yeah, so I remember Steve Strongen came here back in the summer, I guess last summer or earlier the year, and one of his points was oftentimes when we do policy analysis, we think in terms of the theory and we don't necessarily think carefully about the unintended consequences of the best laid plans with the best possible intention. And he gave some examples with some of the credit rating requirements and in banking. So that would be an awesome thing to see happen. Tools that can help us think through third, fourth order implications of legislation. Gavin, did you have your hand up? I just wanted to add one more point on that if you did.
Oh, no. What?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So Michael, it sounds like there is a lot of discussion being generated around the use of this type of tool for better informing the people doing elections, the citizens, and less around the closing the loop on accountability. So having like seeing how the legislators, your local legislator voted and comparing what you actually wanted. Are there questions around that you would like to see explored?
None that come to mind.
I have a thought on that. One of my neighbors in the neighborhood where I grew up became a congresswoman for a while, and I grew up in a very liberal district. She was a very liberal person. She went to Washington, and in her first term, made a deal to vote for some kind of a gun-friendly bill that was basically going to pass anyway. And there are a lot of guns. This is Washington State, so people are liberal, but a lot of them do have guns. She voted for that, thinking, yeah, harmless enough, and managed to get support for a bunch of other things by doing that. And people made a big deal about that, and she was promptly voted out in the next term because of that. And I tend to think I think we had a good legislator that we lost. Now, this is somebody I actually knew, so I'm not pretty objective there. And it makes me think about this kind of accountability. You want explainability and accountability somehow. Because on the one hand, I think most legislators, if they had the option of using this thing or not, might want to not use it because they don't want to have to explain every vote. Look, I'm getting good value for my constituents. I'm trading this away, but I'm getting this. This is the way our political system is designed to work with only two parties. I just assume people look at my overall record and don't worry about my individual votes. So I think legislators might not want to adopt this voluntarily. On the other hand, if it could be a good forum for them to explain themselves, like, yes, I'm going to vote for this thing. I know people don't like it, but look at all the other things I'm getting by doing this for you. That might work better. I don't know. So anyway, that's my. I forget actually where I started with that. I got too far down my own rabbit hole. But
let's get into the transactional nature of actual legislation as opposed to just the details of the legislation itself.
Yeah.
So
I
you
think
should post it in chat. If you're on, can you ask your question? If you're having tech. Oh, go for it.
Yeah, no, I've been going off and on. Sorry about that. No, I was thinking about the usability from the usability perspective. I'm still new to legislation, so pardon me for that. I think one of the things that came to mind was in terms of like what criteria you would need in order to be able to use this application. So I was thinking about like you have to be illiterate, you still have to have internet, you still have to have a smartphone. And then when we think about digital divide, like how does this affect how and when and where this app is used and by whom? And I mean, since it's legislation, it might end up affecting more people than we actually know. So I'm thinking about it from that perspective. And if you could shed some light on that and what are you thinking on that front, that would be great.
Yeah, sorry, I completely forgot about including that discussion that we had initially. You do bring up a good point about the reach and including everyone. Todd suggested that it could be used via SMS as well to kind of further expand the circle of inclusion because not everybody has a smartphone. And then I further suggested that, hey, maybe there's a like a polling station at the public library that you can go to once a week or something to that nature to again expand the circle of inclusion. But yeah, that is a great point and certainly something to look into.
So does the census provide a model for maybe doing the outreach. Because I mean, this year is an anomaly, but traditionally the census is one of the few things in the United States that is designed to reach every single household. And they've incorporated tech into it, but you don't have to have tech because they have an army of people knocking on doors. And I'm wondering if we're at the point where maybe we need an army of people energizing the population to get knowledgeable about what's going on with legislation.
Seems to me that army would become a giant propaganda machine.
Yeah,
pretty easily.
As I was saying it, that came to mind, but
did we lose Todd? Sounds like we lost Todd.
No, I'm still here.
Oh. And I mean, to that effect, I was also thinking about the long-term usability. So, and I completely might be wrong. I'm just doing a thought experiment here. But one thing that I was thinking about was, many times I have an application, I'm thinking about politics, and I just had this discussion with my brother about how might participation be affected in different contexts at different points in time. So like right now, we are highly energized to go vote and do things and get on legislation. But I'm thinking over time, when we have more information on this app, how much time will that actually need for us to spend on the application in order to get our word out? And then is there any way to like rate or review or a comment or figure out like what makes sense, what does not make sense? Because over time, if I'm giving suggestions and it's not being picked up, I might decide not to do it. But that's me. So
Yeah, let me make sure I'm not on mute. Okay. With the submission of ideas, what I did envision was kind of like a Reddit style. I know Todd doesn't like this, but the chance to vote up an idea in order to get more traction. I think that speaks to your question, and the ability to then bring that to a larger body of researchers and legislative writers to bring a bill to maybe a legislator that will bring it to the floor.
Another key part of the way the legislative process worked is the fourth estate. Journalists who read through the whole miserable long thing and know a lot about the history of such stuff and understand who's involved and do all that synthesizing kind of for us in analytical news articles. And of course we get news articles with various different slants and biases and levels of quality and just pure fakeness. But it does seem like there is something really valuable. We've got an institution there to do something really valuable. And it would be worth thinking about ways to loop journalistic analysis somehow into the process with curated links or something. I'm not sure quite how to do it and keep the thing simple enough that it still, fits on a smartphone and happens in plausible amounts of time.
That was one of the topics of conversations here, because I was thinking forward about how this was before we even talked about the NLP, system of disseminating the legislative bills, but who could actually sit down and write these? And I was going down what you were just describing, the fourth estate, in that, okay, I'm just going to have a team of journalists that work for this company, and that's going to be their job. She thinks that it's a very good entry-level job with some training. So the mid and senior journalists aren't going to want to do this, but she sees it as a very viable option to get into the space and use that. Like she said, there would have to be a little bit of training to come up with, all right, here's what to do, and what to do, what not to do, as far as the lexicon, and stay away from, like I mentioned earlier, concentrate on the what and not the why, avoid intent. But she thinks that it's very feasible.
If you did that, then you would be able to, in parallel, do the NL, and then you presumably have humans providing input, sort of checking the work, if you will. Shunde, does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds about right. So I don't know. Have you in the not quite journalistic, but sort of trying to give some detail. I spent a lot of time on Ballotpedia over the last 2 weeks, especially trying to get some detail on who supports and what are the arguments for and against different ballot proposals in California. It sounds like that would be, like, besides having journalistic summaries of different something like just that type of summary of who's in support. It seems like that's already been done, so it seems very feasible to sort of incorporate into this platform.
Correct.
So Michael, this is Jim. I'm a first-year student here. I've got a background in political science, but I've got to say that my focus was not on American politics, but I think I can work my way through some of this. One of the big things we seem to be focusing on in at least part of the conversation is the influence of interest groups and political parties in our legislative system. I think that what you've got going here is really exciting, and I think you might spend some more time thinking about perhaps if there are ways to sort of inoculate this app from undue influence of these institutional organizations like parties and like interest groups, because one of the things I fear with a new technology being put to use is the sort of institutional behemoths co-opting it to their own ends. And I haven't had the chance to think about it too much, but perhaps you might get some leverage through the legislators themselves if they see this as a viable way to get information directly from their constituents, as opposed to being funneled through interest groups or somehow directed by interest groups.
I hear you on that. So I don't know if you could tell from the slide, but one of the ideas that I have is this guy has a little check mark here, which means he's a verified registered voter, which I think is possible to gain access to voter registration, and kind of, I don't know, create a verified system. That way, like you said, inoculate it from people creating profiles to then, kind of create their own agenda. But I do also like your going to the legislators and get their buy-in so that they can have direct connection. Does that answer your question or your consideration?
I think that's one really valuable approach. I still wonder about sort of extra app pressure. So an interest group, a political action committee or something, contacting their members, encouraging them to sign up for the app in order to promote passage or being against a particular piece of legislation. So that might be one thing to look out for.
Got it. No, that's very intuitive. Thank you.
And then one other comment, if I may.
Sure.
This is really cool. And I study blockchain as well. So I love to see possible uses of technology to strengthen democracy. Todd had mentioned second and third order effects, and you are building into this the idea of accountability. I wonder if it might also be possible to integrate this app with other apps and platforms that show like tangible, concrete results of legislation. So an example might be, let's say a bill was up for consideration about, I don't know, a local water treatment facility or something like that. So the app's going to deliver the users the status of their representative who voted on the bill, but then maybe 3 years down the road, when the water treatment facility is actually constructed or under construction, the app is integrated with something else, Google Maps or something that says, look, this actually happened. Or by contrast, this hasn't happened because your legislator voted against it.
Yeah, like a news feed type thing where it again closes that loop of, all right, here's what happened. Here's how it was voted on. Here's the effect. Yeah, like you said, 3 years down the road. I like that. Let me just type that note.
So that kind of begs for a timeline view for all of these. So I could imagine a dashboard of like all the legislation, and then you've got a timeline view from, introduction to the various voting to approval to then seeing some of those effects.
I think a challenge there is going to be that it is all a super complex system. And so if you, I don't know, put in some kind of program to support small businesses, you hope that 10 years later there are more small businesses. But there are so many other things going on too that it's often, sometimes it's legislation to, we're going to sell bonds to build this school, and it's going to be built in 5 years. Well, 5 years from now, is it there or not? But I think a lot of legislation is much more, it's just a lot harder to say what the expected effects are or are not, and whether things happen, whether they happen or not because of the legislation or some other reason. It is complicated.
So, Michael, we're coming up on top of the hour. I guess my question is operational. Do you think that there are people out there who would fund exploratory work, like to do some natural language processing training on legislation to actually see if some of those automated markups are work, and maybe some of the sort of network diagramming if there's ways to do that?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? Who would be interested in this? Off the top of my head, I would think Mark Cuban would be entirely up to this. It's tech, it's politics, it's combining both of them. That would be my first go-to for a big name, just public facing that I know about. I'm not really clued into who the eccentric billionaires are who fund things like this quietly. But yeah, I think with the right support, I think it's feasible.
So I think there's a, go ahead, Tim.
Just George Soros is interested in stuff like this. Whether you want, his name is loaded at this point. But
So are the Koch brothers.
Yeah, obviously, yeah.
Well, I guess I'm wondering if there's a pitch to not, so this is the overall vision that we can build, this app can be built, but I think there are a number of enabling capabilities that need to be explored, like how do you, and I think the NL is one that we have people here who I think, and I'm speaking for like Gavin and Ashunde, but I assume that doing some explorations around that would be something that would be interesting. And network diagrams are something that are near and dear to a lot of folks here. So there may be some pieces of this that would be preliminary steps. It's like, no, not building, it's towards building an app, but these are enabling capabilities that need some messing about with. Ashunde, am I speaking out of turn?
No. I think I would love to do something like this. This is stuff that, like I said, it's an empirical question. But if we can answer that empirical question in the positive, that NLP tools can give valuable insight into legislative documents, that would be a huge boon and a huge finding in general. Gavin, I don't know what you're thinking. You're the one who has experience with defense regulations.
Yeah, well, actually, I don't know if this was a while ago, but do you remember a conversation you and I had, Ashunde, about like a project funded by ICJ that would be looking into ways to be used? Yeah. So the funding situation for that is sort of like being reevaluated, but I have looked at this question kind of quickly, hoping to do a little bit more work. So depending on how those discussions go about the funding, like there might already be something on the books that is quite similar to what we're talking about now. Yeah, and the text summarization of the legal document is something I think is really interesting. I think like stepping outside of the legal domain and just being able to do that for these defense documents, I think would be really helpful for the FFRDCs within RAND also. I think it could be very broadly useful across a lot of policy research areas. Yeah.
And we also, another point on this, not the text summarization part, but the network diagramming. SCAN funded Carter Price in DC last fiscal year, earlier this year, to explore the use of graph databases for showing links between different agents mentioned in legislation. So we might be able to pull on that type of work. I can bug him to see where he's at on that.
Cool. Well, we're actually a couple minutes past the top of the hour. So, Michael, I want to thank you for coming into the conclave.
Yeah.
And hopefully there's some useful conversation. It sounds like we may have actually some do-outs. Ashunde and Gavin, maybe we write a paragraph or two on what some NL explorations would look like on legislative documents.
Yeah, that's definitely, that would be a fun, reachable thing, and we can easily scope the study quickly.
And I think Gavin's point about this being broadly applicable is true. And since we're a policy shop, if we had tools that actually made it so that legislation was more easily understandable, that might be kind of awesome.
I agree.
Especially if you're developing the language, like you said earlier, developing a template so that the NL could read it easier. It's kind of back-ending, like a backwards way of doing it. Create the template for yourself so that you can then disseminate and read it easier.
Yeah, we've already got, it's in chat, legislative markup language, LML.
Okay.
It would be a flavor of XML.
Got it.
And if it could make it easier to write a bill that doesn't have contradictory things that are going to get struck down by courts, that could be actually very attractive to legislative staffers. If they're trying to write a bill that works, and you can say, okay, here's a software that's going to really help ensure this thing is internally consistent, and the links up the way you think it does. That could be really useful.
Just a side comment. Sorry if this puts us even further over time, but like the reason when I first started thinking about this, I kind of arrived at it from blockchain, which has been talked about a few times. But blockchain has smart contracts, right?
Right.
And these contracts they're not really like legal contracts in the way the name might suggest, but they are these pieces of executable code, and there's no ambiguity. And the law doesn't work anything like that. But maybe it would be nice if the law was a little bit more like that, where it was written in a standard format, unambiguous, and it could be to some extent automated. Like, I don't want to go all the way to an extreme version of like a cyber, government, but pushing in a little bit in that direction might be really helpful and simplify things a bit.
There may also be a tie-in with truth decay. Because I think if you can create legislation that's more transparent, you have a better chance of just more broad understanding, and it becomes a little bit harder for people to just tell outright lies about things. Although, I don't know, so it seems to be an easy thing to do these days, but we can dream.
Sounds like we have a plan.
Cool.
Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate the time. Love hearing all these ideas around it, and yeah, possibly working with you together.
Thanks.
Alrighty, awesome. Thanks, Michael. And we'll be in touch. We'll loop back. We'll cogitate on this, but I think there's something to doing some NL stuff. So I think the thing that we would do is create maybe like a very brief proposal of what would be done, and that may be something that you can like shop to see if there are people who are interested in funding it.
That would be great.
Cool.
Thank you, sir.
All righty. Have a good one. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, you too.
Bye.